Imagine a light that has never failed, suddenly flickering out in the heart of a North Atlantic storm. Behind the darkness lay a ghostly silence that would haunt the Northern Lighthouse Board for over a century. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse stood as a lonely sentinel against the violent surges of the cold Celtic Sea. In December of 1900, this remote outpost became the stage for one of history's most chilling maritime mysteries. 3 seasoned lighthouse keepers vanished without a trace, leaving the world to wonder what truly happened that night. The island of Eileen was supposed to be a safe haven for those guiding ships through peril. James Ducat, a man of steady nerves and years of experience, led the small crew on the rock. Alongside him stood Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur, men hardened by the isolation of their vital maritime trade. 4 weeks, the light on the Flannan Isles had guided mariners safely past the treacherous, jagged island cliffs. But when the light suddenly failed, it triggered a series of events that would baffle the finest investigators. How do 3 grown men vanish from a locked island, surrounded by nothing but hundreds of miles of water? The island was like a locked-room mystery, floating in the middle of a violent and unforgiving winter sea. When the relief ship Hesperus finally arrived, the silence coming from the shore was heavy and deeply unsettling. Joseph Moore stepped onto the west landing, expecting a warm greeting from his fellow lighthouse-keeping companions. Instead, he found the gates locked and no semaphore signals waving from the gallery to acknowledge their arrival. Inside the lighthouse, the clocks had stopped, and the table was set for a meal never eaten. 2 sets of oilskins were missing, yet the third remained hanging on its hook near the entrance. What could be so terrifying that it leaves a powerful lighthouse completely dark during a North Atlantic gale? Some whispered of a freak wave, while others feared something far more sinister had stepped onto the shore. To understand how these men could simply vanish, we must look closer at the island of Eileen. The locals call them the 7 Hunters, islands that even the most seasoned sailors feared to tread. Before the lighthouse was built, these jagged rocks were defined by everything that was not there. Emerging from the foam, the Flannan Isles are a group of 7 small, unforgiving islets. They lie isolated, situated approximately 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides in western Scotland. These desolate outposts have stood as silent sentinels, guarding secrets the mainland was never ready to hear. Despite their grim reputation, the islands bear a name belonging to a pious 7th century Irish priest. They are named after Saint Flannan, yet his blessings seemed unable to tame the surrounding wild Atlantic. Why would a place named after a holy saint be considered so cursed by those nearby? For as far back as any living memory served, the Flannan Isles remained entirely uninhabited. No permanent chimney smoke ever rose from these rocks, which defied any attempt at human settlement. Settlers on the Outer Hebrides whispered that it was terribly unlucky to spend a single night there. They believed the islands belonged to something else, ancient powers that did not welcome the living. Perhaps these ancient settlers knew something vital that our modern world has long since forgotten. While men feared to stay, Hebrideans still used the Flannan Isles' sparse turf to graze their sheep. These brief visits were functional, mere moments of utility before retreating to the safety of home. Sailors would land, release their livestock, and then quickly depart before the sun dipped below the horizon. The islands were like a graveyard for the living, a place where no one dared to linger. Even the most desperate explorers found the silence of Eileen to be heavy and deeply unsettling. The treacherous West Landing served as the only gateway into this world of salt and superstition. Here, the Northern Lighthouse Board attempted to bring order to the chaotic and unpredictable Atlantic waves. The lighthouse would stand on Eileen, the largest and most mysterious of the 7 Hunters. Yet no amount of stone or glass could fully erase the legends haunting these remote rocks. To build here was to disturb a silence that had reigned for over 1,000 years. It was into this atmosphere of ancient dread that modern engineering finally attempted to bring light. The Northern Lighthouse Board decided to tame the 7 Hunters with a beacon of stone and glass. They chose Eileen, the largest of the 7 jagged islets, for this ambitious engineering project. It took 4 long years of grueling labor to build a sanctuary on this desolate Atlantic edge. Workers battled fierce storms and vertical cliffs to haul massive stones up the unforgiving island slopes. Despite the constant danger, construction continued until the towering structure finally stood ready against the elements. On December 7th, 1899, the Eileen Lighthouse finally cast its first beam across the dark. This modern marvel promised safety to passing ships, yet it remained dangerously disconnected from the world. While wireless technology was beginning to emerge elsewhere, This remote outpost possessed no such luxury. How do you signal for help when the nearest soul is 20 miles across a churning ocean? The lighthouse keepers relied entirely on primitive visual semaphore signals to contact the distant mainland shore. These flags and lights were like trying to whisper a desperate plea into a howling Atlantic hurricane. The lack of wireless communication would soon prove to be the real tragedy of this lonely island. A rotating crew of 3 men lived on the rock, while a 4th remained safely on land. They spent their weeks polishing glass and trimming wicks, trapped within a silent prison of crashing waves. Joseph Moore was often the man waiting on shore, ready to rotate back into the island's isolation. The lighthouse was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, yet its primitive signals were its greatest fatal flaw. If disaster struck, the keepers could only wave flags at a horizon that rarely looked back. This 19-day delay in communication would eventually leave the world wondering what happened on Eileen. Moore. For those stationed there, the oilskins they wore were their only protection against the biting salt spray. They would eventually scan the horizon for the Hesperus, the relief ship that brought their only hope. Even the sturdy West Landing could not fully protect the men from the threat of a freak wave. The lighthouse was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was also a silent prison of absolute isolation. To manage the isolation, the Northern Lighthouse Board devised a precise rotation for its dedicated keepers. The operation required 3 men on Eileen Moore at all times to maintain the eternal flame. While 3 labored amidst the waves, a 4th keeper remained safely on the distant Scottish mainland. This system ensured that every man received a brief reprieve from the crushing loneliness of the sea. Joseph Moore served as the relief keeper, waiting for his turn to return to the jagged rocks. From the shore, Moore watched the horizon, knowing his companions relied on the strict schedule of rotation. Life on the island followed a rigid clockwork, dictated by the heavy hand of official lighthouse protocol. Each keeper donned heavy oilskins before facing the salt spray that constantly lashed the stone tower. Their duties often took them down to the West Landing, a treacherous ledge carved into the cliffside. Here, the men remained ever watchful for a freak wave that could sweep them into the abyss. Communication with the outside world was limited to the primitive language of distant semaphore signals. These flags were the only way to whisper across the miles of cold, gray Atlantic water. Every task, from trimming the wicks to cleaning the glass, was recorded with meticulous, unwavering detail. The Northern Lighthouse Board demanded perfection, as a single mistake could lead to maritime catastrophe. The Hesperus was the vital link between the lonely rock and the safety of the shore. Joseph Moore waited for the ship to carry him back to his duties on the lighthouse. The rhythm of the lighthouse was designed to survive the harshest storms and the darkest nights. This clockwork existence created a sense of security, masking the true dangers of the 7 hunters. No one anticipated that this structured world was about to be shattered by an impossible silence. The 4-man system was a shield against madness, yet it could not stop what was coming. Behind the stone walls, the 3 keepers lived a life of discipline. Far from any human help, they trusted the rotation, the Hesperus, and the rules that had kept them safe for years. Every day, the keepers practiced the drills that would soon become haunting clues for investigators. The West Landing served as their gateway to the world, yet it remained a place of peril. Within this rigid system, the men became part of the machinery that kept the light burning bright. Robert Muirhead stepped off the rock on December 7th, waving goodbye to 3 men he would never see again. In December of 1900, the routine of the lighthouse was about to be shattered forever by an eerie silence. Superintendent Robert Muirhead completed his final inspection, satisfied with the order within the towering stone walls of the beacon. As a high-ranking official of the Northern Lighthouse Board, his presence carried the heavy weight of maritime authority. He watched the keepers move with practiced precision, ensuring the Eileen Moore light would pierce the coming night. The winter air was biting, yet the atmosphere remained calm as the men prepared for their lonely winter vigil. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur stood together, their faces etched with quiet and professional determination. Muirhead spoke his final instructions, unaware that these ordinary words would soon become haunting echoes of a lost past. What was said in those final moments between the superintendent and his loyal, hard-working crew? Did any of the 3 men have a dark premonition of what was coming across the cold waves? Muirhead's departure was like the final thread of a safety net being cut by the unseen hand of fate. He descended the steep stairs toward the West Landing, where the boat waited in the surging, dark tide. Looking back, He saw the lighthouse standing as a silent sentinel against the gray and unforgiving Scottish sky. The evening of December 7th, 1900, marked the last time human eyes would behold these keepers alive. Muirhead boarded his vessel, leaving the men to the isolation of their island fortress and the surrounding sea. As the ship drifted away, the three figures grew smaller against the massive, jagged scale of the rocks. He could not have known that he was the final witness to their existence on this desolate earth. The lighthouse lantern began its nightly rotation, casting a rhythmic, golden glow across the dark and empty horizon. No semaphore signals were sent to warn of danger, only the standard signs of a routine and peaceful watch. For Muirhead, it was just another successful visit in a career defined by strict and loyal adherence to duty. Behind him, the iron door clicked shut, sealing the fate of those who remained within the stone tower. Weeks would pass before the world learned that something had gone terribly wrong on that lonely, distant rock. Muirhead eventually drafted his official report, documenting his final observations on the 8th of January, 1901. Within those pages, he struggled to explain the impossible disappearance of the men he had left behind. He reflected on the missing oilskins and the locked doors, searching for clues that simply were not there. But on that December night, the superintendent only saw 3 men doing their duty with quiet, steady pride. The Hesperus would return with Joseph Moore, but they would find only a haunting silence and an empty tower. As Muirhead's ship disappeared over the horizon, the keepers were left truly alone with the rising winter storm. The storm hit on the night of December 15th, bringing the first sign of a looming catastrophe. 8 days after Muirhead left, the heavy darkness spoke of a light that had simply vanished. On that fateful morning, the keepers on Eileen Moor dutifully maintained their log until 9 o'clock. As the ink dried on the final entry, the men prepared for whatever the Atlantic would bring. By evening, a sudden and violent squall began to batter the jagged cliffs of the Seven Hunters. Visibility plummeted as the winds howled, testing the resolve of the Northern Lighthouse Board's solitary outpost. Far below the cliffs, the churning sea began a relentless assault against the foundations of the tower. Cutting through the freezing spray was the SS Archtor, an American steamer bound for a distant port. This massive vessel had departed Philadelphia, carrying its heavy cargo toward the historic docks of Edinburgh. The captain navigated the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, searching for the reassuring glow of Eileen Moor. Just before the stroke of midnight, the crew peered through the storm, expecting to see the beacon. Instead of a guiding flame, they found only a void where the light should have been shining. How does a state-of-the-art lighthouse simply go dark during the peak of a dangerous winter squall? The dark lighthouse stood like a silent scream that no one in the world could yet hear. Despite the terrifying discovery, the SS Archtor had to prioritize its own survival against the surging waves. The steamer pushed onward through the night, leaving the silent rock and its missing light behind. When the vessel finally docked at the port of Oban, the captain immediately reported the chilling observation. He spoke of the darkness over the Flannan Isles, a warning that should have sparked immediate action. Why did such a critical report take so long to reach the authorities at the Lighthouse Board? The gears of bureaucracy turned slowly, even as 3 men remained unaccounted for on that lonely rock. But the urgent warning from the SS Archtor would not be acted upon for several more days. The relief effort was delayed, stalled for days by the same violent weather that likely caused the disaster. For 19 long days after the last departure, the lighthouse on Eileen Moor remained shrouded in icy silence. The relief vessel Hesperus was originally due on December 20th, yet the storms refused to break their grip. Captain Jim Harvey waited anxiously for a window of calm as the winter seas continued their relentless assault. On the ship, relief keeper Joseph Moore paced the deck, his mind heavy with dread for his colleagues. It was not until the cold dawn of Boxing Day that the Hesperus finally weighed anchor and sailed. The morning of December 26 brought a deceptive stillness to the Atlantic as the vessel cut through waves. As the 7 hunters emerged from the mist, the crew strained their eyes for any sign of life. When the Hesperus finally arrived, the silence from the shore was more terrifying than the storm itself. The ship sounded its whistle, a lonely blast that echoed against the jagged cliffs without any human reply. Captain Harvey watched the horizon, expecting the customary signal to rise from the stone beacon of Eileen Moor. To his growing alarm, the flag was not flying from the stand where it should have proudly greeted them. The absence of that simple cloth signaled a profound break in the rigid Northern Lighthouse Board routine. Every sailor knew the protocol, yet the lighthouse stood like a blind giant, unresponsive to the approaching ship. Where were the provision boxers that should have been staged and ready for the long-awaited restocking? The empty landing was like a house, with the front door wide open and the lights turned off. Not a single soul appeared on the west landing to catch the lines or assist with the supplies. Joseph Moore stared at the rocky shore, his heart sinking as the reality of the silence took hold. No semaphore signals flickered from the gallery, and no smoke rose from the chimneys against the gray sky. The meticulous order of the station had vanished, replaced by an atmosphere of cold and absolute desertion. Captain Harvey ordered a rocket fired, yet the bright flare brought no men running to the cliff edge. Something was terribly wrong on the rock, a mystery that defied the strict regulations of the Lighthouse service. The lack of a welcoming committee felt like a physical blow to the men who braved the seas. With a ship anchored in the swells, the decision was made to send a small boat toward shore. Joseph Moore stepped onto the island alone, walking into what would soon become a waking nightmare. Having left the safety of the Hesperus, Joseph Moore walked slowly toward the towering Eileen Moore Lighthouse. He reached the entrance gate and found it firmly closed, barring his way to the hidden truth. The main door of the lighthouse remained shut, as if the tower itself was keeping dark secrets. Pushing open the heavy door, Moore stepped into a space that felt more like a tomb than home. He found himself standing in a museum of the Three Keepers' final quiet moments on the rock. The interior was shockingly clean, a testament to the discipline required by the Northern Lighthouse Board. To his surprise, the lamps were all cleaned and refilled, ready to pierce the dark Atlantic nights. It was a scene of domestic perfection that seemed to mock the absence of the three men. In the kitchen, the washing up was finished. Every plate and cup returned to its proper place. Who cleans a lamp or dries a dish before stepping out into a lethal, swirling mystery? The lighthouse was like a clock that had been wound tight and then abandoned by its maker. Despite the order, an unsettling feeling began to take hold as Moore continued his solitary search. In the sleeping quarters, the sense of normalcy vanished when he saw the beds were unmade. The tangled blankets whispered of a sudden interruption to a night of much-needed, deep sleep. If they had time to scrub the dishes, why was the morning ritual of bed-making forgotten? Every detail Moore observed felt like a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. He knelt by the fire grate and reached out a hand toward the piles of cold ashes. The fire had died long ago, leaving the room with a chill that bit deep into his bones. This cold hearth proved that no one had tended the station for several long, dark days. The silence in the lighthouse was deafening, amplified by the rhythmic crashing of the waves outside. Moore called out the names of his friends, but only the hollow echo of his voice returned. The contrast between the maintained lamps and the abandoned beds created a chilling, impossible scene. Every chore completed was a sign of life, yet every empty room signaled a sudden tragedy. He stood alone in the center of the tower, surrounded by the haunting remnants of his companions. But as he looked closer at their equipment, the fragile mask of perfection began to crumble. As Joseph Moore stepped further into the lighthouse, the silence felt heavy with unspoken secrets. Then, he found the first clue that changed everything about this ordinary morning. In the quiet kitchen, Moore's eyes fell upon a single chair knocked over on the floor. This overturned chair was the only screen left in a room that was otherwise silent. Looking toward the walls, Moore noticed that every clock in the lighthouse had stopped. Time itself had frozen, locking the secrets of the lighthouse behind hands that never moved. The stopped clock suggested a moment of total stillness amidst the chaos of the storm. But it was the gear by the entrance that truly chilled Moore to his core. 2 sets of protective oilskins were missing from their usual places on the hooks. These missing suits indicated that 2 men had ventured out into the freezing Atlantic gale. Why would seasoned keepers leave the safety of the stone tower for the violent dark? Yet, in a startling discovery, 1 set of outdoor gear still hung perfectly in place. Why leave 1 set of gear behind when the rule was never to go alone? Only 2 men had dressed for the outside, leaving a 3rd man behind or forgotten. The scene wasn't a planned departure. It was a desperate flight into the unknown. The 3 keepers of Eileen Moore were gone, leaving only these haunting clues behind. What made someone knock over a chair in such a sudden, frantic hurry? The missing oilskins suggested the men faced the storm at its most brutal peak. With every discovery, Moore's pulse quickened as he realized the gravity of the situation. Only 2 men had dressed for the outside, leaving the mystery of the 3rd man unsolved. If the answer wasn't inside the lighthouse, it had to be outside, on the treacherous west landing. Joseph Moore first inspected the east landing, which remained strangely untouched by the recent Atlantic storms. But the West Landing told a different story, revealing a scene of absolute and terrifying destruction. The power required to move a wanton rock and bend solid iron railings is almost beyond comprehension. Moore stared in disbelief at solid iron railings that had been twisted and bent like simple straw. These heavy metal guards were no match for the unrelenting force of the North Atlantic's winter fury. Nearby, a supply box, located exactly at sea level, had been completely smashed into tiny wooden shards. The destruction continued along the path, where the iron railway was violently wrenched from its concrete housing. It appeared as though the very earth had been torn apart by an invisible and hungry giant. Most incredible was the displacement of a single rock weighing significantly more than a full ton. This massive stone had been tossed aside as if it were nothing more than a light pebble. Moore looked upward, seeing that the damage extended far beyond the immediate reach of the waves. At a staggering 200 feet above sea level, the island's high cliffs bore deep, jagged scars. Thick sections of turf had been ripped away, leaving the bare rock exposed to the freezing wind. This damage stretched 10 meters back from the cliff edge, suggesting a wave of impossible, towering height. What kind of titanic wave can rip grass from a cliff 200 feet above the sea? Log entries later confirmed that this extreme storm damage occurred before the three keepers vanished into history. The men of the Northern Lighthouse Board had watched this chaos unfold from their high stone tower. They had seen the West Landing being systematically dismantled by the very ocean they were hired to watch. Every broken rail and displaced stone served as a grim testament to a power far beyond humanity. The sea hadn't just visited the island of Eileen Moore, it had violently and thoroughly ravaged it. Joseph Moore stood amidst the wreckage, staring at the incomprehensible power that had visited the West Landing. The evidence carved into the landscape suggested a force far beyond any ordinary Atlantic gale. To understand what happened to the keepers, one must look closely at the twisted remains below. Investigators from the Northern Lighthouse Board would later struggle to explain the sheer scale of the damage. The physical scars left on the island provided a chilling map of a catastrophic event. Heavy iron railings, designed to withstand the fiercest storms, were found bent like mere copper wires. These sturdy barriers had been mangled by an unimaginable pressure that defied typical weather patterns. The metal was twisted into grotesque shapes, showing where the relentless sea had finally broken through. Every inch of the landing bore the mark of a violent, watery assault that left nothing untouched. Even the most resilient structures built by man had surrendered to the ocean's terrifying strength. Near Tepat, the railway track had been completely wrenched from its solid concrete housing. The massive iron rails were torn loose, lying scattered like discarded toys across the jagged rock. Seeing such heavy infrastructure uprooted indicated a hydraulic force that was almost impossible to calculate. Concrete and steel had failed to hold against the surging weight of the cold Atlantic. The path to the lighthouse was now a graveyard of industrial debris and shattered stone. A storage box, situated at 0 feet above sea level, had been smashed into unrecognizable pieces. This heavy container was obliterated by the first strikes of a surging, monstrous wall of water. Only splinters remained where the supply box had once stood firmly against the coastal spray. The destruction reached heights that seemed to defy the very laws of maritime physics. Something massive had climbed the cliffs of Eileen Moore, leaving only ruin in its wake. Further up the slope, a rock weighing more than a ton had been moved from its bed. No human hand could have shifted such a colossal weight across the slippery Unaben terrain. The sea had somehow lifted and displaced this massive boulder as if it were a pebble. This displacement offered grim proof that the water had reached heights few believed possible. The weight of a single ton had been tossed aside by the sheer momentum of the ocean. Most shocking was the damage found nearly 200 feet above the churning sea level. At this incredible height, the thick turf had been violently ripped away from the cliff edge. The ground was stripped bare for 10 meters, exposing the ancient stone hidden beneath the grass. Only a freak wave of gargantuan proportions could have reached such a staggering and deadly elevation. The evidence at the summit mirrored the devastation found at the very edge of the water. Scientists later pointed to these physical anomalies as definitive evidence of a rare rogue wave. This scientific grounding transformed local legends into a terrifying and measurable reality for the investigators. The missing keepers had not just faced a storm, they had encountered a literal wall of water. Every piece of twisted metal and displaced rock told the story of an inescapable, watery fate. The mystery of Eileen Moore began to resolve into the shape of a single, towering nightmare. There was no more hope on Eileen Moore, and the frantic search became a grim formal report. The message sent back to the mainland was chillingly simple. A dreadful accident has happened. On December 26, 1900, Captain Harvey prepared his urgent telegram for the Northern Lighthouse Board. Every word in the dispatch carried the heavy, suffocating weight of 3 lives lost to the sea. This telegram would provide the first official word of the catastrophe that struck the 7 hunters. The Hesperus turned away from the desolate rock, sailing toward the shore station at Breskly. The ship moved through cold, gray waters, leaving the silent lighthouse far behind in its wake. However, the island was not entirely abandoned to the elements and the ghosts of the missing. Joseph Moore remained behind, joined by 3 brave volunteer seamen to keep the vital light burning. For Moore, staying was a heavy duty, a final vigil for the friends he had lost. They watched from the gallery as the Hesperus vanished into the mist, bound for the mainland. Upon reaching Breskly, Captain Harvey immediately sought a way to transmit his devastating news. The telegram detailed the eerie silence in the empty lighthouse found by the relief party. It was the final period at the end of a tragic sentence for the lighthouse families. How do you tell a waiting family that their loved ones had vanished into the Atlantic? Even as the search continued around the jagged cliffs, a grim reality began to set in. Despite every effort, no bodies of the 3 missing keepers were ever found in the surf. The ocean had claimed them completely, leaving only empty oilskins and broken iron as evidence. The mystery of their final moments remained locked within the crashing waves of the West Landing. On the rock, Moore and his volunteers faced the long, dark nights in a haunted silence. The news of the disappearance soon sent shockwaves through the entire maritime world. In the decades that followed, the truth wasn't enough for some. They needed monsters and ghosts. You might have heard about a half-eaten meal left on the table, but that is a lie. Sensational stories began to overshadow the chilling reality of what Joseph Moore actually found on Eileen Moore. Popular legends claim the keepers abandoned their dinner in a sudden, panicked rush toward the island's edge. However, the official records confirm that the kitchen was tidy and the washing up was completely finished. There were no plates of rotting food or overturned chairs waiting for the crew of the Hesperus. Why do we feel the need to invent drama when the actual truth is already so unsettling? The myth of the half-eaten meal is merely a false embellishment designed to spice up a tragedy. Another persistent shadow over the mystery involves the supposed final entries in the lighthouse logbook. Tailies describe the men as being in a state of deep mental distress, crying and behaving irritably. These chilling descriptions of crying keepers are entirely fictitious and never appeared in the original logs. The men were seasoned veterans of the Northern Lighthouse Board, not prone to such sudden emotional collapses. Even the lack of semaphore signals from the island was eventually twisted into a dark, supernatural omen. Where did these fabricated stories of madness and despair actually come from in the first place? The fictitious details about the keepers were actually added years later by an American pulp magazine. Pulp writers took the silence of Eileen Moore and filled it with sensationalized lies for their readers. These myths grew like weeds over a grave, obscuring the evidence found at the West Landing. By inventing fake logs, these writers turned a workplace accident into a supernatural horror story. The Northern Lighthouse Board never reported any signs of mental instability among the 3 missing men. We must separate the pulp fiction from the real evidence of oilskins and a freak wave. Stripping away these layers of fabrication allows us to see the tragedy with much clearer eyes. The true mystery doesn't need fake meals or crying men to remain one of history's greatest enigmas. Once we finally strip away the fiction, the real mystery left behind is even more haunting. Without bodies to bury, the imagination of the public ran wild regarding the keeper's final fate. If it wasn't a storm, was it something else that claimed those 3 men? The fact that no bodies were ever found fueled a century of dark speculation. In the absence of physical evidence, the vacuum was filled by wild, impossible tales. Some suggested that ancient sea monsters had risen from the depths to take them. Could sea monsters really explain the bent iron and the sudden, silent disappearance? Others whispered of phantom ships that appeared in the mist to spirit them away. Why does our mind go to the supernatural when the natural is so deadly? These wilder theories were a mirror for the collective fears of the time. Too many, the thought of a freak wave felt too simple for such tragedy. They looked for monsters in the foam because the truth felt far too empty. Stories of giant sea serpents at the West Landing began to circulate in harbors. Each new theory was more outlandish than the last, born from a desperate silence. The lack of recovered remains meant that, for some, the keepers were still out there, Did they leave voluntarily, or were they dragged into a world beyond our own? Reports reached Joseph Moore of ghostly sightings made by passing ships for decades after. These stories became legends, distancing the tragedy from the cold reality of Eileen Moore. Even officials from the Northern Lighthouse Board found themselves wondering about the impossible. The mystery became a canvas upon which the world painted its most vivid nightmares. Every unexplained shadow on the rock was seen as proof of a lingering curse. Yet, these stories often ignored the violent reality of the North Atlantic weather. We crave monsters because a random wave feels like an unfair ending to life. The empty oilskins left behind only served to deepen the growing supernatural dread. But the experts looked not to the stars or the deep, but to the water itself. After months of investigation, the Northern Lighthouse Board finally reached a chilling verdict regarding the missing men. The most terrifying explanation is also the most likely. A single rogue wall of water struck. Imagine a freak wave like a mountain that suddenly decides to move against the unyielding stone cliffs. Joseph Moore had already witnessed the absolute devastation at the West Landing during his initial frantic search. Iron railings were twisted like ribbons, and massive crates had been tossed aside by an incredible force. The investigators focused on the oilskins found hanging inside, suggesting a hurried departure into the storm. According to official procedure, leaving the Eileen Moore Lighthouse completely unattended was strictly and explicitly forbidden. Yet, the evidence suggested that all three keepers were outside together when the disaster finally occurred. Did they break protocol to save the equipment, or were they desperately trying to save each other? One man likely saw the danger coming and rushed out to warn his companions on the landing. The Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that a massive sea surged over the island with no warning at all. This wall of water would have been invisible in the darkness, a silent killer from the deep. No semaphore signals could have summoned help fast enough to escape the reach of such a monster. Even the seasoned crew of the Hesperus could not have predicted the violence of that specific moment. How do you fight a wave the size of a building when there is nowhere left to run? The heavy gear they were trying to secure became anchors in the surging, cold North Atlantic tide. The official report painted a grim picture of duty meeting a force beyond any human comprehension. It wasn't monsters or madness that claimed them, but the raw, unchecked power of the ocean itself. Their final moments were likely a blur of salt, foam, and the roar of a breaking sea. The silence that followed was the only legacy left for those who came to find them. The lighthouse stood as a lonely monument to 3 lives swallowed by the churning gray waters. While the theories continued to swirl, the official record remains fixed on that one fatal wave. The Flannan Isles kept their secret well, buried deep beneath the waves that still crash today. In an instant, the rules were broken, and the sea claimed its due from the 7 hunters. As the waves settled, the duty of mourning fell to a man who knew the keepers well. Superintendent Robert Muirhead arrived representing the Northern Lighthouse Board to seek answers for the grieving families. This wasn't merely a formal investigation for Muirhead. It was a deeply personal search for lost friends. He remembered waving goodbye to the men on Eileen Moore just weeks before the storm hit. Now, he walked through the silent rooms where the 3 keepers had once lived and breathed. On January 8, 1901, Muirhead sat down to pen the definitive account of their mysterious disappearance. His report meticulously detailed the physical evidence scattered across the ravaged and desolate West Landing. He considered how Joseph Moore first discovered the empty lighthouse after leaving the safety of the Hesperus. The memory of those desperate semaphore signals for help still echoed in the cold Atlantic air. Muirhead struggled to reconcile his knowledge of the men's professionalism with the chaos they left behind. He noted the missing oilskins, suggesting the keepers had prepared for a struggle against the elements. The Northern Lighthouse Board required a logical explanation for how 3 seasoned men could simply vanish. As he wrote, Muirhead likely felt the heavy burden of being the last to see them alive. His investigation focused on the sheer power required to tear iron railings from the solid rock. Every detail pointed toward a singular, catastrophic event that caught the keepers completely by surprise. Finally, Muirhead reached the chilling conclusion that would define the mystery for over a century. He reported that a freak wave must have surged up the cliffs to claim the unsuspecting men. This massive wall of water likely swept them into the depths during their final moments of duty. His findings on January 8th offered a grim finality to the Northern Lighthouse Board's exhaustive search. Yet, even as the ink dried, the personal grief of Robert Muirhead remained etched in every word. The official report closed the ledger, but the haunting silence of the 7 hunters lingered on. Behind the formal language lay the heartbreak of a man who lost 3 of his finest keepers. The mystery of 1900 changed the way we look at the Flannan Isles forever. For 70 years after the tragedy, men still climbed those stairs until the machines took over. The Northern Lighthouse Board continued to staff the Eileen Moore beacon after Joseph Moore's time. They followed the routines of those who vanished, keeping the flame alive against the dark. Generations of men wore the same heavy oilskins, braving the spray of the West Landing. They remembered the freak wave and the semaphore signals that once failed their brothers. Every keeper recalled the Hesperus, the ship that discovered the tragedy so many years ago. Each new watch felt the weight of history as they looked out toward the horizon. Can a machine feel the ghosts of the men who came before them? In 1971, the era of the human lighthouse keeper finally came to a silent end. The Flannan Isles lighthouse became fully automated, leaving the island to its ancient solitude. Automation was like the island finally being allowed to be silent after decades of watchfulness. No more boots echo on the stairs, yet the light continues its rhythmic pulse. Is the island safer now that it is empty of life and human error? The lighthouse remains in operation today, piercing the fog just as it did long ago. It stands as a tireless guardian, watching over the coast while keeping its own secrets. Sailors still look for its beam, unaware of the shadows that haunt the rocks below. The machinery hums where men once spoke, a mechanical heartbeat in the cold Atlantic. Though the keepers are gone, their story is etched into the very stones of Eileen Moore. The light still shines today, a lonely sentinel over a century-old secret. The files may be closed, but the debate surrounding Eileen Moore continues to haunt our modern imagination. What do you think happened on that rock during that fateful, storm-tossed night in late December? Was it truly a freak wave, or is there a deeper secret hidden within the crashing surf? If you were Joseph Moore, would you have found the courage to stay on that lonely island? Perhaps the oilskins left inside the lighthouse hold the true key to their final, desperate moments. Each piece of evidence suggests a story that the Northern Lighthouse Board could never fully explain away. We invite you to share your own interpretations of this enduring maritime mystery in the comments below. Your insights might provide the very perspective needed to understand what happened at the West Landing. Did the Hesperus arrive too late? Or was the fate of the keepers sealed long before landfall? Could a forgotten semaphore signal have changed the course of history for those 3 lost lighthouse souls? History is rarely as simple as a formal report, and your theories keep these past echoes alive. Join us as we continue to explore the most captivating and bone-chilling enigmas from our shared history. Every comment you leave is a vital piece of a puzzle we are still collectively trying to solve. Subscribe to our channel and journey with us through the shadows of the world's greatest historical mysteries. Ensure you never miss a chapter by hitting the notification bell for our latest detailed historical investigations. What other secrets are hidden in the North Atlantic, waiting for a curious mind to find them? The legacy of the 7 hunters remains, watching over a sea that never gives up its dead. We thank you for watching and for helping us keep the memory of these men alive today. Stay curious, stay questioning, and we will see you in our next deep dive into the unknown. Until next time, may the light of truth guide you through the darkest corners of our past. The mystery of the Flannan Isles awaits your voice to help complete its tragic, unfinished story.